My name's Chesa Boudin, and mainly want to thank everybody for coming out today. I'm really excited about the event, but before we get to that, we have just a few housekeeping items. I want to thank Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, not only for making today's event possible, but for his vision and leadership in creating the Criminal Law and Justice Center, of which I'm absolutely thrilled to be the founding executive director. This is our center's inaugural event, and in just a few moments we're going to get started. But I also have a couple of other thank yous. I want to thank Tony Mendocino. I want to thank Madi and Hannah and Jenna and Alicia and Audrey, who have done a tremendous amount of work today to make this event possible, to make sure everything runs smoothly. And I especially want to thank my wife Valerie, who surprised me by getting a babysitter so she could come and join us today as well. So as you all know, and as is customary at events at the law school, we have to start with a reminder about free speech. Free speech and academic freedom are foundational values for the University of California. UC Berkeley is committed to the belief that speech we may not like or agree with should be confronted with respectful speech rather than with censorship. UC Berkeley's principles of community call for civility and respect in our personal interactions. If you would like to express a point of view that is different from what our guests present this afternoon, you may do so in any area of campus that is open to public free speech. You, of course, may ask questions at the appropriate time. However, you are not permitted to disrupt this event. We ask that you as audience members be respectful of the speakers and students in attendance and refrain from any disruptive behavior. If you attempt to disrupt the event, you will be asked to leave the venue and face possible student disciplinary action. So with that, it is my absolute honor and privilege to introduce our speaker for today. Angela Davis is Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness and Feminist Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. An activist, writer, and lecturer, her work focuses on prisons, police, abolition, and the related intersections of race, gender, and class. She is the author of many, many books, from Angela Davis, an autobiography, to Freedom is a Constant Struggle. Her most recent book, written with Professor Gina Dent, who we have the privilege of having with us in the room today. Thank you for joining, Gina. Erica Miners and Beth Ritchie, is called Abolition, Feminism, Now. In addition to all of those things and so many more, I want to just say a few more words about Professor Davis. What it really comes down to is that she's one of those people who always shows up. So much so that she may not be able to stay for the whole reception today because she has other things she has to show up at. But seriously, in addition to the scholarship and to the intellectual firepower that she has brought to this movement, to so many movements, to generation after generation of students. In fact, I know some of the folks in this room who helped make today's event possible took classes with her decades ago. She has literally been doing this work for decades, empowering, educating, inspiring generation after generation of folks, like so many in this room, who are going to go on, who are already doing the work on the front lines. Creativity, compassion, energy, and an unrelenting commitment to justice. Angela Davis. You have your own mic. It may be turned off, so we may need to turn it on. Well, thank you.
I try not to drink out of plastic cups.
Good idea.
I was just saying, I have my own water because I try not to drink out of plastic bottles or plastic cups.
Inspiring and leading by example, as we would expect. Absolutely. Here I am drinking out of a plastic cup, so, you know, we all have room for improvement. The format for tonight, just so folks are kind of familiar, is we're going to basically go back and forth with a few questions, and we're going to save time. I'm going to try to keep track of time and save some time at the end for questions. We will not, I'm sure, have time for everyone's questions, but we'll do our best. And I want to just kick it off with a really high-level question. You know, in the news all the time, we're seeing what I would describe as fear-mongering. We're seeing the really aggressive pushback by police unions and Republican strategists against the criminal justice reform movement. And so I want to just ask you, in the midst of that pushback, in the midst of all of the backlash to the work you've done for decades to end mass incarceration, how do you remain hopeful?
First of all, good evening, everyone. And before I try to address your question, Chesa, let me say it's really good to see you. It's been a little while. And congratulations on your new position.
Thank you, thank you.
Here at Berkeley Law. And I feel really honored to be a part of the inaugural event. This is the inaugural event, right? It is. So everybody congratulate Chesa Boudin for his position at the Criminal Law and Justice Center. Did I get it right?
You did.
Okay.
I think it's behind us, too, if we need a cheat sheet.
Oh, it sure is. It sure is. Okay. You know, everybody's talking about the backlash. And it started, it actually served as an occasion, all of these discussions about the backlash that is underway now. It made me wonder why we value the possibilities of our organizing so little that we don't foresee that when we win, there will be a reaction, or when we appear to be in the process of winning. So it made me think that we generally don't take that into consideration because we don't develop strategies beforehand to deal with what we inevitably begin to call the backlash. And I think that we may not believe that the work we do will have the kind of impact that it does. I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? During these last 3 years, I guess, beginning with the summer of 2020, we began, well, first of all, we experienced the largest demonstration in the history of this country. That's a monumental achievement. And more white people went out into the streets than ever before in the history of this country to protest racism. And that means something. Perhaps the historical amnesia that has characterized life in these United States prevents us from understanding the full impact of those moments. So I myself wasn't surprised. I mean, what should we have expected? That the Supreme Court would kick, what's his name, Clarence Thomas, I mean, I'm not sure what we actually expected. But the problem is we didn't plan beforehand, how to deal with the what's the guy's name down in Florida?
Ron DeSantis.
So, we didn't make plans to deal with those kinds of developments, and we should have, because we should have known. In many ways, what we call the backlash is an indication of the power of the victories we managed to achieve. And I suppose I would say that it's also a sign that we should not continually minoritize ourselves, not continually assume that there's no way that what we're doing could make sense within the larger mainstream. I know I was really shocked when people began to talk about abolition and defunding the police. But it happened at that particular moment because it had been rendered possible. Not because we had reached a moment where we could actually abolish prisons and the police, but where those strategies became more acceptable to ever larger numbers of people. And that, it seems to me, is a sign to deepen the organizing, to reach out to ever more people. Yeah, and that to me is actually a reason for hope. I mean, for many people, it's a sad moment because we don't have that collective sense of possibility that existed for a little while. But we should treasure the moments when we experience that. I like John Berger's writing, the cultural critic, late cultural critic, his writings on of course, he wrote largely on art and culture, but he also wrote about the meaning of demonstrations. What it means for vast numbers of people to come together and express ourselves in a collective voice. So he calls demonstrations a rehearsal for revolution. But it's just a rehearsal. It allows us to begin to experience what it might feel like to be a part of a vast community of people who are demanding revolutionary change. So I'm actually really hopeful because I know that change never happens in a linear fashion. It's never the case that you make your demands and you go out and demonstrate for them, and then they are immediately satisfied. That never, ever happens. But what does happen is that we go out in the streets and we are active within all of the various venues and sites of cultural activism, university, law. We do that work. And we create language that allows us to imagine something that is even more radical. And I think we're at that moment now. And institutions are undergoing the impact of these shifts in public discourse. But I don't know. I've always been accused of being an inveterate optimist, but I do think this is a very exciting period. We haven't yet left that moment behind. Let's not forget that.
Well, I super appreciate that, and I know, as we all navigate loss and hardship and disappointment and defeat in our own lives, things that every one of us in this room has experienced and will continue to experience, it's really important to find ways to continue to be hopeful, to remember that sometimes, even if we don't expect to win in the short term or at all, the fight can be worth fighting for its own sake, because we have limited time on this earth, and we want to find ways to make the most of that time and to make meaning of that time. And
so I have a question for you, Chesa. And it has to do with the reasons why you are at this institution now, and not the, what was that office you...
It's not on the wall behind us.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about everything that has happened in your life within such a short period of time, personal as well as political, I can remember when I talked to you immediately after the recall, and I was fuming. I was so angry. And you let me blow off all of this steam for a while, and then you said, the struggle continues, and it may not continue in the way I wanted it to in this venue, but it will continue in others. And then you sounded really excited about moving on to do something else. But this was a period during which your father was released from prison after 40 years, and that was something that we didn't really expect. But at the same time, we should have expected it, because people have been working so hard, including your mom, Kathy. And then, of course, your mom dies on May 1st. In the process of doing work on Beyond the Bars. The last conversation I had with her was about the plans for the Beyond the Bars session in 2022, yeah. So you asked me about my optimism. I should ask you, you're still excited about doing the work that needs to be done after having experienced all of that within such a very short period of time.
I couldn't be more excited to be here with all of you. And I really mean that, and I'm going to tell you why. Because I learned a lot of lessons during my time in office. And one of the lessons that resonates the most powerfully is that if we're not doing the long-term thinking and organizing and institution building, then it doesn't matter that much who we get elected. Doesn't matter who's in office if we don't have strong social movements, if we don't have intellectual firepower, if we don't have good ideas and policies, if we haven't done the work to till the soil to make change possible. And so we can elect whoever it is we want to elect, to whichever office it is, President of the United States, Pope, you name the position. But if we are not doing the work, if we treat their election like the end of the road for our organizing work, for our litigation, for our education, for our research, for our community building, then there's no way they will achieve even half of what it is we hoped for them to achieve. And I saw that every day in San Francisco. I saw the political space that opened up in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. When I was district attorney, I saw the work that we could do, not work that I can personally take credit for, but work that was really standing on the shoulders of giants like you, who had been doing the thinking, who had been developing the policies and the ideas and the solutions to problems impacting our communities for decades. And I also saw at the end of 2020, when that window started to close, and part of the reason was, in San Francisco at least, the people who had been protesting for Black Lives Matter were no longer in the streets, were no longer demanding change. We've got to continue to do that work. And I recognize that a lot of the work has to happen in places like this. Places like the university where you spent most of your career, where you can do the long-term thinking, where you can be principled and pragmatic, but where, regardless of who's winning a particular election or what a particular poll is showing is on voters' minds in that moment, we can do long-term planning and organizing work. So that's part of the answer. The other is just a very personal part of it, which is, in a very short period of time, my first child was born, an amazing blessing. My mom died. We knew she was fighting cancer for 7 years. She was on the phone with you planning a conference called Beyond the Bars while she was getting chemo in her final months, because she loved what she did, because she believed in her work, because it was who she was. And so as much as we mourned her loss, we continue to celebrate her life and her contribution and her energy. And the fact that she lived long enough to see her first grandchild born, to see her partner come home after literally 40 years in prison, are huge victories in and of themselves, given the severity of the cancer and the length with which she was fighting it. And so I celebrate those things, and I do that in the context of family, of a son and a wife and adoptive parents and adoptive brothers who are part of my community. And I would just say to everybody in this room, as you confront loss and challenges and disappointments, which are inevitable in this world and often out of our control, if there's one lesson I learned from having my parents in prison from the age of 14 months, it's that no matter how unfair things are, we have to find ways to accept the things out of our control and to continue fighting and find ways to be effective given the hand that we're dealt. And that's exactly what I'm doing here at Berkeley. Thank you for letting me join you.
I was just remembering, Chesa, when Kathy first told me that you were thinking about running for district attorney in San Francisco. Chesa's mom and I went to high school together. So we've known each other since 1959. So she said, well, what do you think about that? Because she wasn't that excited about it. She says, do you think he should really run for a district attorney? And I said, I don't know. But anyway.
Well, I want to ask you about that. I actually want to ask you about that because many people in this audience and watching online know you, among many other things, as being the brains behind abolitionist theory, among all the other contributions you've made.
Along with a lot of other people.
A lot of other people, yeah. No doubt lots of people played a role, and you are one of those at the center of that stage with others, arm in arm, developing theories that involve imagining alternatives to incarceration, to policing, different ways of defining safety. And I know as in the conversations we have in this law school and certainly with law students across the country over the last year that I've gotten to talk to, there are many folks who will say, and who have said to me, if you are a prosecutor, then by definition you have sent people to prison, or you have held people in jail who ended up being innocent of the crimes they were accused of. That's sort of a place where I just can't go. I can't support that. There's not room for that in our movement. I don't want to associate with that. And yet you endorsed me for election in 2019 for district attorney, notwithstanding my mom's reservations. And in 2022, when they were recalling me, you came out not to one event, but to multiple events on multiple occasions in multiple different venues to stand up and speak out against the recall. And similarly, right here in Alameda County, you endorsed Pamela Price for election. And I don't know if you've taken a position on her recall yet, but tell us a little bit about why it is that you were willing to support me for DA and Pamela Price for DA, even though you are and continue to be an abolitionist. And how does that square?
Well, I don't really see a contradiction there. First of all, I should tell you, I don't think I've ever told you this, Chesa, but when I got out of jail in 1972, people kept asking me to run for office. And
It's not too late. Am I right?
And
sorry, Gina.
And so my response was, let me think about it. I don't really see myself running for office, but if I do run for office, it will be for the position of sheriff of Marin County. I did actually run for office later on the Communist Party. But anyway, I didn't see a contradiction between endorsing you and Pamela Price for district attorneys of San Francisco and Oakland, and attempting to do the work that will persuade ever larger numbers of people that we have to dismantle institutions that cannot assist us in developing a radical democracy. Why can't DAs, progressive DAs, radical DAs, attempt to undo the institutions that are responsible for the incarceration of vast numbers of people? You had decarceration did you use the term decarceration?
We did.
Yeah.
We also used the term ending mass incarceration.
That's right. You had ending mass incarceration. But decarceration is one of the primary elements of abolitionist strategy, developed back in the 70s by Linda, what's her name? Linda Knopf. There's another name that I'm missing in there. You can't remember it either? Honey, of course, Honey. Thank you, Linda Honey Knopf. And in this book that was published in the 1970s called Instead of Prisons, decarceration is one of the major strategies that we can engage in right now as we try to imagine a moment in our history, in which we no longer have to depend on repressive institutions like jails and prisons and police when they will have become obsolete. So I don't know why you would exclude, maybe you would exclude the vast majority of DAs who do the work of reproducing those means of massive incarceration. But if you decide that you're going to use the office differently, why not? And at Pamela Price's victory celebration or inaugural moment, I can't exactly remember what it was, I was impressed by the fact that she said, until we can say that prisons no longer exist, we have to develop a strategy that will move us in that direction. So, yeah.
I kind of think of it as a form of harm reduction in the context of a system that does tremendous damage to people every day. And maybe an analogy would be supervised consumption sites with all of the fatal overdoses that are happening. And there are folks who might argue, well, we just shouldn't have people overdosing. We just shouldn't have people in jails or in prisons. And we have to figure out how to get from A to B. And in the meantime, we've got to save lives and we've got to reduce the harm. And so I was tremendously proud of the decarceral work we did during the COVID pandemic, reducing the population of juveniles, of kids that were in cages in San Francisco juvenile detention by more than 70%, reducing the number of people in the adult jail by more than 40%, so we could actually close one of the jail buildings, and reducing the number of people in state prison out of San Francisco County by more than 20% through resentencing. Not just exonerating people who were innocent, which we did, but also identifying people who'd been in for so much time that there was no rational or civilized possible justification for continuing to keep them in cages and saying enough and bringing them home. And that was work that, in all the years I spent as public defender fighting one case at a time, I never would have been able to decrease the carceral populations that much. Never.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the work that you... And let's also remember that it's important to insist on historical memory. Let's remember that we have to, because it's about forgetfulness, right? We forget very easily that all of this work was done within the course of 2.5 years. And if the numbers of people incarcerated in San Francisco County jails could be decreased within that period of time, what's possible? We should have all been over there in San Francisco challenging the recall.
Hey, you were there.
Well, I was there, but I remember, I'm trying to remember, I was speaking somewhere and you were speaking there as well.
SF State? You were on Zoom for that one.
Yeah, no, it was another place. It was
amazing. She was like full on screen. We had a panel of speakers, and then Angela was the only one on Zoom, and it was like her face on a Zoom connection, but it was like a screen this big. You remember that? That was fun.
I didn't see it because I wasn't there. But there was an event where we spoke outside. Do you remember? And there were tables.
At Zeitgeist, it's a bar in San Francisco.
No.
See, I just outed her. She did come to the bar.
I was there, but this was an outdoor event. Anyway, I'll remember. You'll remember where. This man came over. This black man came over to talk, and I'll never forget how passionate he was about preventing the recall, because he said there are all of these black young men and boys from the East Bay who come over to San Francisco. San Francisco has always been the city. I mean, we don't have that same relationship to it as we used to. But he said, if Chesa is recalled, they'll no longer be able to come over and without expecting to get stopped and arrested. And like I said, he was really passionate about preventing your recall, because he knew that it was going to mean vast changes in the everyday lives of people who see San Francisco as a place, to have fun, who were black. And simply because they're black, they would be proscribed from enjoying the city. Yeah, and I'm just wondering whether, to what extent what he said has come true.
Sadly, he was accurate in his fears and his predictions. And not only are we seeing an increase in San Francisco pretextual traffic stops, that was another policy that we implemented to refuse to charge cases that stemmed from pretextual traffic stops because it's such a long-running and deep-rooted problem in San Francisco. Not only did they end that policy and our police engaging in widespread pretextual traffic stops, but actually it was just in the news last week that at least one police officer has been found in the San Francisco Police Department to systematically erase the race of the people that he's pretextually stopping. So he is writing reports identifying black and brown motorists as white so that the statistics about his stopping policies look like they're closer to race neutral than they really are. So that man that spoke to you was really on the money. And I have a lot of other questions that I want to ask you, Angela. I'm mindful of time. I know there's some people in the audience itching to ask you questions. So I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to just ask that our student volunteers be ready after this last question. And I'm going to ask Angela to take hands from the audience. And the way we'll do it is, folks, just stay where you're seated, raise your hand, and we'll have student volunteers from the Criminal Law and Justice Center come to you with the microphones, and we'll get as many questions as we have time for. But I'm going to take the prerogative and ask one last question here first. And I'm going to kind of try to combine a few questions that I had. I think about my role in this new job, and part of the reason I'm excited to be here, I talked about it's a different role, it's a longer term role, it's a deeper thinking role. And yet the political work that's happening around the recall in Alameda County and the things we're seeing in San Francisco continue to be really important. And I would love to hear your thoughts and your perspective on the relationship between theory, social movements, electoral politics, and particularly the role that students, like so many in this audience, have to play in that work.
Well, we talk about intersectionality, and we often only think about it in terms of identity. But I think it makes sense to try to grasp the relationship between what is happening in the streets, the organizing that is being done, what is happening in the classrooms, the theorizing that is happening, the work that intellectuals do, and what is happening in the electoral front, to see that as interrelated phenomena, not to assume that one is entirely separate from the other. And as a matter of fact, I think that the most effective political theorizing emerges from an attempt to hold all of those sites in tension and to recognize the relationality that links them together. That is to say that we often tend to assume that political leadership is the last word in change in our society, and that's not true. If you actually think about the fact, when have massive changes occurred because of someone who was elected? I mean, we assume that when we become passionately involved in electoral politics, we imagine that change as being attached to the body of the person we're trying to elect. But when you think about it, the change that has happened in this country and all over the world has happened as a consequence of large numbers of people joining hands, making it known that we will no longer accept the status quo. That was what we call the civil rights movement. which people then didn't say the civil rights movement, they said the freedom movement, because civil rights was only one element of that movement. And of course, law students who understand the role of the law can easily grasp the meaning of that assumption that civil rights will bring about the kind of change that we all want. It simply, no, I guess I can't go on and talk about that because there's not enough time. But I'd like to see us. I'd like the law students, since this is a law school, who study law, who understand the law, but who also understand the limitations of the law, who also recognize that change happens as a result of movements, as a result of mass movements. That has always been the case, and I think it will probably continue to be the case. But I also want to say that when I was in jail, a lot of law students, including from this law school, were involved in the campaign and are in part responsible for the fact that I was freed. Yeah. Does that respond to your question?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. And thank the law students who did that work, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to have this event. We wouldn't have so many decades of contributions that you've made. We have time for a few questions. If folks can raise their hands, maybe we can start on my left with Madi, find someone, and then we'll go to Hannah on the right, and we'll try to get as many voices as possible. Please do keep your questions to questions.
So what I wanted to quickly ask was if we as
where are you?
Sorry, right here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask is that if we as a society don't rely on elected individuals and instead utilize, society's movements for change, why do we as a society place so much trust on our systems that are, we understand to be corrupt and, ineffectual at achieving change to make that change? Why do we still put so much faith in it?
Well, I didn't say that that elections are meaningless. I did not say that there's no element of change involved. What I tried to say was it's not enough. And when we begin to fixate on elections as the only path toward change, then we miss the role that movements always play whenever there is a major change. So why, when you ask why do we always do it? It's about ideology. It's about the ways in which we learn how to imagine our relation to society, to the world. It's very easy to assume that all you have to do is elect somebody who's better, and things will change. I mean, we're confronting that situation right now. There are those who are saying that all we have to do is elect the best candidate. And even if you have the perfect candidate, even if you have someone as impressive as Chesa Boudin in the office, that actually is not going to make very much of a difference unless his work is linked to the work of movements, the work of masses of people. So it's not either or, it's a feminist perspective. So instead of saying either or, what do we say? Both and, absolutely. But thank you so much for the question.
Hi, Professor Davis. My name is Kayla Allen. I'm a 1L here. As a former teacher, I have a special interest in how do we have early intervention to keep people out of prisons. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are on the potential of interrupting the school to prison pipeline as part of the abolitionist movement.
Oh, that is, thank you so much. And that is something that we absolutely have to do. We only have an hour for this. It's too bad. We should have allotted at least 3 or 4 hours. So
Next time.
So that we would talk about the carceral arena, not only in relation to jails and prisons, but also, for example, the child welfare. If one looks at the ways in which the foster system works, the violence that is inflicted on children, and how parents suffer, that is as much a part of the carceral system as jails and prisons or immigration detention facilities. So, abolition is really about expanding the imagination as well and encouraging people to think more capaciously. And there are many other arenas in which that kind of carcerality can be witnessed and which need to be included in a conversation about abolition. But thank you so much for mentioning the school. It's not just the school to prison pipeline. It's about schools embodying the very carcerality that we often only see in jails and prisons. But thank you again so much for the question. Okay.
I think juvenile halls are among the worst elements of our current prison system. San Francisco decided years ago to close its juvenile hall, but now that movement has completely halted because no one has any idea what to do with the so-called undealable children who are still in there. Do you have a thought about the best strategy to suggest we have to close juvenile hall and here's what we can do?
Well, thank you for that question, because certainly youth prisons are very high on the agenda of abolition. But what is so telling about campaigns that revolve around institutions of incarceration, including psychiatric incarcerated, including the historical incarceration of disabled people. What is so interesting is that we see this unending repetition. There's a book that's called Last One Over the Wall that was written by the former superintendent of youth prisons in Massachusetts. And what he writes about in his book is that that he was charged with making youth prisons better. And he tried everything. He tried all of the existing strategies, and it never worked. It was still repressive. The violence still continued to exist. And so what he did then was to say, okay, let's just close them all. And this was in the 1980s, I think. And so all of the youth prisons, what we call juvenile halls, all of those institutions were closed down. And so it meant that in Massachusetts, they had to think about how to address issues of education, how to address issues of housing, how to address all of the ancillary questions that were responsible for kids being placed in a situation where they end up in a place like juvenile hall. And that is what abolition attempts to do, not to myopically ask, how can we make these institutions better? How can we make a better prison but leave society in exactly the same condition as it was when all of these people ended up going into these carceral institutions? It's a more capacious apprehension of the problems that are responsible for relying on institutions of violence and repression. And of course, most of the time, our impulse is, oh, that's too complicated. It's too complicated to think about all of those things. Let's just deal with the institution itself. That is basically what has happened throughout the entire history of the prison. The history of the prison has been a history of prison reform. That was Foucault's insight in Discipline and Punish, where he points out that it's exactly the same history. The history of the prison is a history of efforts to reform the prison, and they all fail, because it cannot be done unless one takes into consideration the larger social forces that are responsible for the production and reproduction of such violent institutions. So that's the beginning of a conversation on youth prisons, but thank you so much for your concern.
I think we have time for one more question from over here. I'm sorry we're not going to get to everybody. Hannah, you have someone? Yeah.
Cool. Hi, Professor Davis. My name is Dominic. I'm a 2L. And speaking of the law and its limitations and very complex systems, I am incredibly interested in reparations and how reparations fits into the project of abolition. And so I'm curious of your thoughts on particularly California's reparation task force and its proceedings and how it's moving about the conversation of reparations, and how you see abolition fitting into the project of reparations, or vice versa, reparations fitting into the project of abolition.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think we need to pursue it. Certainly in places like Chicago, when there was an attempt to develop a strategy of reparations in connection with, what was the police chief?
John Birch, the one who was torturing.
Who was responsible for the torturing of more than 100, as we know of now, and so the campaign has led in some very interesting directions, including in relation to abolition. But I guess I'll say, this is a larger conversation, and I really wish we had, the opportunity to sit down and delve into the issues. But I will say that because of the fact that we usually think of of our human worlds as composed of individuals, not communities. We usually assume that the individual is the unit of society, and the abstract individual. I mean, read the Constitution. It's about guaranteeing that we will think in those terms, that we will not imagine ourselves as members of a larger community, but rather as disconnected and separate individuals. If we didn't do that, we would think of reparation in larger terms. We wouldn't think that each individual should be given this or that. We would think about the changes that need to happen in this society. And we would be aware of the extent to which capitalism, and I should have said capitalism a long time ago. I apologize for not bringing it into the conversation earlier, because that is, precisely the reason capitalism, racial capitalism, why it is so important to think in structural terms, and why this moment of change led to, among masses of people, a reconception of racism as structural rather than as an individual flaw, a defect in individual personalities. That's major. That's really, really major. And so I think also reparations has to be formulated in such a way that it will assist in bringing about changes in the very structures, in the racist structures, the patriarchal structures, the homophobic structures of our society. And then we can go on from there later.
In one moment, I'm going to ask you all to join me in thanking Professor Davis in one moment. I have a couple of quick announcements, so bear with me. First of all, we have a lunch hour coming up on October 19th that the Criminal Law and Justice Center is sponsoring. It will be in many ways a continuation of today's conversation. We're hosting Mari Narvaez from Puerto Rico to talk about her work building alternatives to police and police accountability. On October 24th at 4 p.m., we're going to be hosting a panel discussion with contributors to a book called Evidence of Things Unseen, to discuss the role of media and narrative in creating perceptions of safety and how we can use those narratives effectively as lawyers and also as movement folks. And I would encourage all of you to come and join us at those events and many other events we have at the center. But more immediately, in a few moments, we have an event upstairs, the continuation of this event, in the Steinhardt Courtyard. We're going to have heavy appetizers. We're going to have, at least for a little while, Professor Davis, Professor Gina is going to join us. Gina Dent is going to join us. I'm going to be there. My wife Valerie is going to be there. Come meet us, enjoy, have some food, hang out, enjoy the beautiful weather. And now, please join me in thanking.
Wait, before we end, may I just say, I failed to tell you that I think it's really important that you name this formation of criminal law and justice. Criminal law and justice. And I think there's a pause after the criminal law. It's not the criminal modifies law, but does not modify justice, right? Because we're beginning to learn that justice is much larger than can be contained simply within the context of a law that was developed specifically under capitalist conditions. So that, thank you for that. I was thinking, instead of saying criminal justice, we've shifted our vocabulary to talk about criminal legal institutions, right? And justice is very uncomfortably positioned there. Justice needs to be somewhere else. And I like the fact that it's by itself in your...
Well, I like that too, and we spent a lot of time and energy debating whether the word criminal should even be in the title of the center. But we are very much dedicated to putting the justice back in the legal system. And that's work that I hope everybody in this law school, in whatever direction their careers take, whether it be civil or criminal law, whether it be practicing law or not practicing law, finds ways to do, because there is a real shortage of justice in courtrooms all across this country. And that's work we can all join together in doing.